If you like the show, please give us a like and subscribe. If you'd like to learn more about specific legal issues, post about it in the comments or give us an email at juristjargon@gmail.com. Please enjoy today's show. Hi, welcome to Jurist Jargon. If you like today's show, please give us a like and subscribe. Just a quick reminder, we're not attorneys, and what we're giving you on this show is not legal advice, so if you have any legal problems, please seek out an attorney in your relevant jurisdiction.
Hi everyone, it's Will here, and this week we're doing something a little bit different. David and I are going to be busy and out of town all weekend, so we're recording this on Friday night instead of over the weekend like we usually do. Most of the episode will be now. And then Sunday night, we're going to set a little time aside for anything that develops or anything new that we find over the weekend. Hopefully it all works out. Thank you.
All right, so I guess we should get the elephant, talk about the elephant in the room. Ukraine has been the talk of politics all week between the releasing of the transcript of President Trump discussing, corruption and military funding to Ukraine with the Ukrainian president. That's kind of been the talk of the week. Also, there was the release of the whistleblower report that happened just here in the last few days. We're going to kind of get into both of them. We're not going to go word for word through both of them, but we're just going to generally talk about them. So to start, I think we should start where all of this problem kind of came up from, and that was the whistleblower report. So I've read the whistleblower report. I think there are a lot of problems with it. I also think it's much less relevant now that the transcript's out. But the first thing that kind of concerned me about the whistleblower report is that it never should have been reported to Congress or to the Inspector General. Really, there's one glaring report, and that's the authority under which this whistleblower, acted. So basically, under, 50 USC 3033, Section K5, basically sets out the process for a whistleblower to come forward with a complaint. There are some requirements, and one of the major requirements is that this complaint needs to be an urgent concern. Now, the code goes on to define that, and it's referred to in the whistleblower's complaint itself. However, my big problem is that in referring to the relevant statutory authority, the whistleblower basically cut out the relevant part of the section that would say that their complaint does not meet the urgent concern requirement. Basically, the whistleblower relies on part of the code that says that an urgent concern is a flagrant problem, abuse, violation of law or executive order or deficiency relating to the funding, administration, or operation of an intelligence activity within the responsibility and authority of the Director of National Intelligence involving classified information. Now, that's a really wordy way.
There's a lot there to digest.
That's a really wordy way to say that somebody has to have abused their power to basically affect the funding or operation of one of the intelligent community's activities, and it has to be underneath the purview or authority of the Director of National Intelligence. That's kind of the concise version, and the whistleblower report, conveniently for them, cuts out that about 2/3 of that. The whistleblower does not refer to the fact that this affects the funding and operation of intelligence activity, and it also does not refer to the fact that the phone call between President Trump and the president of Ukraine is not under the authority of the Director of National Intelligence.
Right, and I think we've done a lot here breaking down different elements that go into a crime, and we've definitely seen distinctions where some things are more subjective versus objective. Of course, what we have with the Ukrainian call, anyone could, and lots of people have, considered it a flagrant or abusive. The problem here is that there are objective criteria which need to be met, and they simply weren't in this case. This was, this was a diplomatic phone call, not really an intelligence activity of any sort. And so it is concerning that he ran it up the ladder, and he did follow the proper process for that, but not on an issue that should have fallen within his the purview of the intelligence community. And one thing that I'd want to note is I'm not hugely familiar with federal whistleblower law, but in state law particularly, whistleblower complaints are very formulaic in what you need to do to gain those protections. And this process really needs to be strictly adhered to in pretty much any case I've ever seen. So this, though it seems like a small distinction, could actually be really problematic for the whistleblower.
But for me, it's more than just problematic for the whistleblower. It's really problematic for the executive branch, because we're kind of saying, by letting the whistleblower go about this in an improper manner, that no conversation the president ever has is going to be classified from anyone, because at any point in time, a whistleblower believes that something is of an urgent concern, even if it doesn't meet the requirements. They just put forward the report, and when it gets rightly rejected by the Inspector General and the Director of National Intelligence, when it's rightly rejected,
Rejected as being an urgent concern is what you're referring to specifically, right?
Or just a valid complaint. It doesn't meet one of the requirements necessary to be forwarded to Congress. And then there is a process laid out that was followed here that the whistleblower can go through to go around the approval of the Inspector General and the Director of National Intelligence to just go straight to Congress. And if we're saying that the other requirements, such as an urgent concern, not be met, then why wouldn't every whistleblower using a politically charged issue that would be confidential with the executive branch not just follow that process and put forward a complaint to Congress that does not meet the necessary criteria just because it's damaging to political opponents?
Right, and that's not to say here that this whistleblower was poorly motivated, but it is important to have safeguards within the law which insulate against future improper motivation, especially for something like this that lets you bring classified executive intelligence to the legislature. The president's always going to have enemies in the legislature, and they're always going to be hoping for something like this to be brought to them. And once it enters the political arena, it's going to be seized upon and abused. So I do think that it's important, no matter who the president is, to have a stronger wall than what functioned here.
But I also want to just make it very clear, we're not disparaging whistleblowers. I think whistleblowers are very important, and I always think it's better that the public have more information than less information. Just having some information be public really damages the president's ability to act as the chief driving force between foreign policy.
Yeah, I agree that whistleblowers are really essential to addressing corruption. I've actually gone very back and forth with my employment law professor about how strictly these kinds of cases must follow the statutory requirements, because I think it's unfair that if you make one technical error in how you report your whistleblowing, then you can lose all protections and safeties. But it is an important counterbalance to the law because of the protection that's provided.
And further, there's more problems with this whistleblower report than just, the technical aspect that they really didn't have the authority to bring this complaint. And that is that nothing in the whistleblower report, none of the information came firsthand. And I think that everyone can weight that however they wish to. I think different people are going to say that has different value. But to me, that does kind of damage the credibility. I'm not saying that what the whistleblower said isn't true. But what I'm saying is that the fact that this whistleblower didn't have firsthand knowledge, that lots of this came through second and third hands and other reports and were corroborated by other publicly released documents, does shake my credibility in it. And I think it is further shaken that when you read the report, there are lots of things said about the Ukrainian call that I would call gross misrepresentations. The whistleblower report made many statements about things that happened within the call to Ukraine and mischaracterized a lot of things in that call that, when you actually read the transcript from the call, make many of the claims seem much more benign than the whistleblower would have you believe. Now, I'm sure that came because they didn't have firsthand knowledge of the call, but now that we, as the public, have firsthand knowledge, we can now evaluate the claims. So we can now evaluate the claims of the whistleblower against the transcript that was released for the call. And I think when you read that, you will see that the whistleblower made things seem much more sinister than they were, or they occurred much more subtly in the conversation than the plain speak that was relayed through the whistleblower. The whistleblower also makes some further claims about, Rudy Giuliani, meetings with Ukraine, which I don't think is a problem at all. I think the president should be able to have confidential conversations through his attorney with Ukraine, even if it doesn't go through the intelligence community. For me, I think private conversations are not a violation. But I do have, I do think that we have to take these concerns seriously, because we're talking about public tax dollars being used as a leverage over foreign countries for personal benefit. And so all of these claims must be taken with the utmost seriousness. But we also have to evaluate the credibility of those making claims. And the credibility here has several things that have, struck my confidence in the whistleblower's claims. And the transcript has further, I think, shed light on the whistleblower's, that has shown that the whistleblower's claims are not quite as cut and dry as perhaps many partisan politicians would have you believe.
Right. And my problem here, so far as credibility, is, if this is hearsay evidence, to analogize this to like a criminal issue, you can call the police and they can start an investigation based on hearsay, but that's not going to be admissible in court. Now, the problem is that this whistleblower's report has entered into the political arena through an impeachment trial. And so how it's used is going to be much, much more similar to evidence, instead of as just being something that initiated the investigation. And so I do think that allowing this whistleblower report to be handed to Congress based on hearsay evidence, it really illustrates the problem with the hearsay effect. I also wanted to talk a little bit about, and we're going to kind of talk about the report versus the transcript, is that one interesting fact is mentioned in this report that really does put a different light on the conversation in the transcript, I think. According to the report, the Ukrainians didn't know that their military aid had been delayed until a month after this phone call had happened. So if the theory is that President Trump was trying to withhold the aid to pressure them to investigate Hunter Biden and his involvement with this Ukrainian oil company, I don't understand how he was withholding that aid as leverage if the Ukrainians didn't know that leverage existed yet.
No, I think that is an excellent point. I think the counter-argument would be that there were many conversations, according to the whistleblower report, between different representatives of Trump and representatives of the president of Ukraine. And I think that that many who oppose the argument you just made would say that, of course, they knew about it. They had discussions, through one of their many other meetings. Just didn't happen on this phone call. But also, I'd like to point out what hearsay is, because you kind of just threw the word out without explaining what it meant. And it's for those who maybe don't know quite exactly what that is. Hearsay is when a party who is not testifying at trial, who is not under oath, has made a statement, and then someone who is testifying in the trial, or evidence that has been admitted, is relying on the person who's not there, the words of the person who is not there. And that's usually inadmissible, because we can't question the person who made those statements. We can't get to the bottom of whether the veracity of those statements, because we can't really dive down to the issues. We can't see how well they knew the facts. We can't allow people to make up their own mind about how credible those statements were when we don't know who they were.
And if I'm giving those statements in front of a jury, they might think that I'm credible, that may be because I believe those statements, but the jury should be able to assess the credibility of the person I'm reporting on. And, again, it's usually not admissible. There's some exceptions, but that's usually where statements themselves are an element of the crime. Like conspiracy. Like, what I'm saying to plan the crime is going to be admissible, and I'm not going to admit to it, so got to allow it there.
Well, there's a lot of exceptions. That's a very unfun part of evidence to learn because there's so many, but...
I love that one. There's a very simple rule, and then we have all of these, hundreds of exceptions to learn, so... Start reading them.
It's really easy until you get to the exceptions. So the next story we were going to talk about today, because we don't want to spend too much time just, diving on the Ukraine story, but we kind of wanted to go back to what we talked about in our first show. We kind of talked about, the signs of a recession coming, the Fed, whether the Fed was going to raise or lower its rates. We do have some more news on that. In our first show, we talked about how the Fed raising or lowering its rates and the stock market were not, by themselves, were not great indicators for a recession. And we said that because those are all driven by consumer confidence, and really that consumer confidence will affect other things in the long run than just the stock market. And when we start seeing the extrapolation of the effect of lowering of consumer confidence, that's when we really need to look and start worrying, or at least having a deeper discussion about whether or not we're headed towards a recession. And so one thing to look at is the consumer report, which has just come out for August, and that is basically the sum of all economic activity, in the U.S. for the month of August. And we had
sounds like quite a report to go through.
Well, I'm sure it's they came up with a metric rather than viewing all of it, but the expected growth of consumer activity was estimated to be 0.3%. That's because we had a fantastic growth rate in the second quarter. In the second quarter, we had a growth rate annualized of 4.5%, which would be fantastic. However, as with all things that have spikes of growth, it slows down. Growth slows down over time. And so the month of August actually only had a 0.1% of growth instead of the 0.3 that was estimated. Now, that's a very negative thing when you consider that the revised estimates for total economic growth in the U.S. have slowed to between 2 to 3% compared to the 4.5% annualized that we looked at in quarter two.
And so it's my understanding with these monthly percent growth rates that you want to multiply it by the number of months, of course, to look at annually what the annual growth would be. It's kind of a cheap conversion between the two. So this 0.1% looks more like it would be indicative. If this was average, it'd be 1.2 annual growth, correct? Okay, so it's not. It may sound like a larger distinction than it really is between the 3.6 and 0.1 when we distinguish between an annual growth rate and the monthly growth rate. I just wanted to make sure that was clear because I actually had to look that up. I was really shocked when I misunderstood that.
Well, I mean, for me, it's in what this is telling us. It's one thing to look at the numbers, but to translate that into kind of an understandable way for how that affects normal people's lives is that more people are choosing to keep money in their pockets rather than spend it. So people are spending less money on goods and services that they want and saving. Really, that has to do with people are nervous about something. They think that the economy is going to suffer for something. Right now, that seems to be the tariffs on China. At least that's what the places like Reuters and the New York Times are telling us, that the tariffs are the big problem. And that is a problem because it creates a lot of uncertainty. People don't know how the quote unquote trade war with China is going to end up, and there's going to be a lot of upheavals in business because of that. One thing is there was a news article that recently came out, and I don't know the veracity of the article, but if this were to happen, this would be a big deal, is that Trump has discussed removing Chinese companies from the stock exchange, the American Stock Exchange.
That sounds like an interesting problem, because then what even happens to Americans who own stock in that company? I suppose they'd probably still be able to transact with it, but it's going to severely limit their ability to sell that property to somebody else.
I mean, I would imagine it would just move to a different market, perhaps the London market or something like that. But it would definitely be an inconvenience, and it would be more indicative of kind of where the United States and China stand on that trade war. And
Right.
but like I said, that's all very macro. On the micro level, it's more about what are people doing? Because
Right.
this is all
and I think you touched on something here that I kind of wanted to see if you could illustrate. Maybe was you were talking about how this creates like uncertainty on behalf of the consumer, and how that's not good for the consumer or the economy. I'm just wondering, like on a micro level, like how does that look? Like if I'm Joe Consumer and I'm really concerned because of all this uncertainty, like what does that mean? Does that mean I'm not going to try to like finance a house right now?
I mean, that's one thing you might not try to do. It means more about like your monthly spending, your budgeting. You're probably going to spend less on your non-necessary goods. So everyone has to eat, everyone has to drink food, and everyone needs to pay to live somewhere. Those things probably won't change that much. It's more about recreational spending, going to the movies, spending money going to fairs or going out and doing stuff that we generally find fun, stuff like that. And we did see that happen. The Consumer Report actually goes into kind of what made up the percent growth and decrease, and we saw a large decrease in that type of recreational spending. However, we saw growth in some other areas, which did keep us to a 0.1% growth, but that's a very small growth.
No, it's incredibly small. I'm just trying to help everyone understand better where this is coming from and what this means. Basically, bridging that micro view to that macro view.
Yeah, it's just the average consumer is not affected by tariffs from China. They just aren't. Unless you're a business owner, interacting with both the U.S. and China, it's not likely to affect you horribly much. Your prices of goods you might buy might increase. That's something that would affect you. However, something that would affect you is the fact that because this occurs, other large investment groups are behaving in ways that are investing conservatively. So they might pull their money out of the stock market, or they might move their money out of Chinese companies or out of companies in the U.S. that what's the word when you send work to a different country?
Outsourcing?
Yeah. Okay. So cut this and then put outsourcing.
Yeah.
So companies that outsource, people might want to move out of just because the cost of goods are going to rise. And when people start pulling in large sums of money out of the stock market, that gets other investors to see that. They start to think, well, what does that person know that I don't know? This is all kind of part of noise theory for finance. And I really don't want to go into that. There's a lot of different theories about how the stock market works. Noise theory is one of them. It basically says that all the buzz people make affect the pricing of and valuation on the stock market. But so when notable investors start pulling out, you as average Joe might see that on your MSN Money or some other investing website and decide, hey, maybe I don't want to put my money in there. You start taking it out, putting it in the bank, or moving into assets that are less likely to be damaged by a recession. And that's when you start seeing, the flow of money around the economy to different businesses, to your different local Walmarts, your Kroger's, whatever, your local stores. You start giving them less money, which means they stop spending as much money to their employees, right. And it kind of halts this flow of cash flow through, our society.
Right, and I do want to touch on too that noise theory thing. And, there are a lot of different theories about how exactly that noise translates, but it's definitely a real effect. There are plenty of securities law cases that actually deal with major actors in the stock market or major investors manipulating those effects to their advantage, which is a form of securities fraud. So yeah, there's a lot of dispute about how exactly it works, but the fact that the market is affected by this sort of noise within the investment space is absolutely a real thing. The markets fluctuate a lot based not just on like individual companies' earning reports, but also on just interpretations and emotions, reactions to the market.
And if you guys like conversations about kind of corporate finance, stock market theories and stuff like that, we can definitely do more of that. So if you have stuff like that, please shoot us an email at juristjargon@gmail.com. We'd love to field your questions.
But only questions about that, right?
Yeah, only about
other types of questions.
Only about corporate finance. No legal questions, because our podcast isn't revolved around like legal issues or anything.
Awesome. Just wanted to make that clear with everybody. Right, so this is our last story that we're going to be talking about for now. Again, this will be followed by a Sunday follow-up recording. But what's been going on with the medical industry right now, or rather medical healthcare fraud right now, the Department of Justice has a healthcare fraud unit, apparently, and they've been leading a coordinated national enforcement effort to investigate Medicare referrals. And in the arrests leading up to today's specific case, they've charged over 380 people in crimes accounting for more than $3 billion. And they are charging dozens of people at a time who are involved with different Medicare referral schemes. Now, just to be clear, right off the gate, it is a federal offense to accept a referral fee for referring a Medicare patient. So if I'm a general practitioner treating somebody who's on Medicare, it's not necessarily a problem for somebody with private insurance if I refer them to an orthopedic surgeon and we have some sort of revenue sharing that happens there. There's lots of regulations on how that revenue sharing has to occur, but it can exist. If my patient's on Medicare, I cannot touch that fund because they're basically being given the government's money, and the government doesn't want to incentivize unnecessary referrals. So, to combat this, the DOJ's led this massive national effort, and today 35 individuals were arrested, many of them doctors, in a genetic testing scheme that goes a bit deeper. Not only was fraud committed, a kickback scheme committed, but they actually spent billions of dollars in false genetic testing for cancer screenings.
Well, that's terrible.
Yeah, no, it's dark stuff. So my understanding of the product they were selling was a genetic screening, like 23andMe or Ancestry.com, but they were supposed to be specifically looking for gene patterns that make you susceptible to cancer, or more likely to develop cancer. They were complete bogus. Patients were rarely, if ever, getting copies of their test results. They were completely unusable to the doctors in any meaningful way to help guide any treatment. And the only reason the doctors were referring the people for this genetic testing is because they were charging Medicare patients for the genetic testing. So the government was paying to have the tests done. And then the fraudsters here, the healthcare companies, I put that in scare quotes, were splitting the Medicare fee with the doctors because it didn't actually cost them that much to run fake genetic tests.
And so, from my understanding of this, is that the DOJ has decided to charge many of these telemarketing companies with bribing these doctors, essentially.
Telehealth companies, not telemarketing.
Oh, excuse me, as telehealth companies, as bribing these doctors for doing this. And I think this kind of highlights one of the major problems with our healthcare system, is that our healthcare system is very complicated, and there's a lot of rules and regulations, and the more complicated you make things, the more likely there's a loophole somewhere in there that somebody can kind of, get away for a while with doing something we don't want, and then we have to, create task force like this to, investigate all these treatments around the country to make sure nobody's abusing the Medicare system.
Right, and there's also the inverse effect of that, I would say, which is that we also have individuals who think that they're doing everything okay. They don't have any ill intentions. They're trying to do something positive, and they accidentally break a federal law or regulation, and they're just held strictly liable for it. There's a lot of federal regulations have no intent requirement, and so they're sucked under the bus with these fraudsters that we have to go out of our way to target, just because there's too many of these complex regulations for them to know all of them.
And by no intent requirement, you mean that they're strict liability crimes. It means that if the thing that was illegal in the crime happened, it doesn't matter whether you were trying to do it or not. The fact it happened means you broke the law.
Right. There's some pretty low intent standards out there, like negligence, I think, is the lowest form of intent. It just, you didn't try hard enough to avoid it. You acted carelessly in trying to avoid it. It could have been avoided if you were careful a little bit. Strict liability does not care. It doesn't matter if, my exact desire was to hurt somebody. It doesn't matter if if I trip and fall into a strict liability crime, I'm liable for it.
To finish this show off, we're going to talk about how California and its legislature have created new bills to allow collegiate athletes to get paid.
Yeah, so first of all, this bill has already been signed by the governor. So barring any repeal or amendment, it is slated to go into effect in 2023. Specifically, the bill is allowing college athletes to hire agents and to gain revenue through endorsement deals.
So they would be paid through other companies soliciting them, not through the schools themselves, correct?
Right, and that's also an important caveat, is that they can't take on endorsement deals that would directly conflict with the interest or the rules of the school. So let's say if they had all Adidas gear, like their jerseys and their shorts were made by Adidas that they played in, they couldn't have a uniform made by Under Armour and try to wear an Under Armour uniform on the court. Specifically, the bill prevents that.
And so can you go into kind of why this was an issue, why this hasn't happened until now?
Right, so it's been the rule, since the inception of college sports, so far as I'm concerned, that, they are amateur athletes, and therefore they're not supposed to be paid or compensated for playing. And the NCAA has very strongly held to that standard. They're very hawkish when it comes to enforcing these rules. However, there's been increasing pressure, especially in recent years, with people talking about the kinds of lives that college athletes have to live.
Yep.
A lot of them just have trouble making ends meet, getting by on whatever scholarship and loan money they can take out for school.
I kind of know how that life is. Not particularly fun. Very busy.
Yeah, well, when I went through undergrad, I had, all of my cost of living, air quotes, covered by financial aid and scholarships. Really is not enough to make ends meet, and I had to work a lot part-time to put things together. I was more just an academic assessment here. And, a lot of these kids, just because they're going to a great school doesn't mean they came from a great background. If their families can't help out, they don't have the option to work part-time like I did. They're way too busy with their athletic schedule. I'm sure you can attest to that.
Yeah, and I mean, I went to a small D3 school, so we didn't spend nearly as much time as some of these other schools, but I mean, it was still a large impact on my time. I mean, I spent several hours a day doing this. As far as I understand it, Division I players can spend upwards of 8 hours a day. I mean, that's a full work day doing just your athletics. Then you have to go to school, study, and pass your classes on top of all that. So, I mean, I've read schedules of athletes in Division I programs, and they often have days with, every minute from when they wake up at 5, 6 o'clock in the morning to, 7 or 8 o'clock at night scheduled when they account for, their studying and stuff like that.
Right, and not only are they not able to subsidize their college income because of that kind of scheduling, but also they're probably spending more than a lot of students. Athletes working at this level, they're going to be blowing through shoes, they're going to be working through athletic clothing, And so now they need to spend money to do the thing that occupies so much of their time they can't make money. And I know a lot of people are able to take sort of a blasé stance on this. At least when I've talked to some people about this, like, well, they're gonna go to the NFL next year and make, $100 million. Well, two things. One, that doesn't change the fact that some 19-year-old kid, his freshman year at D1, is going to bed hungry. And two, a lot of them do not end up going to the pros. A very, very small percentage of college athletes end up there.
But it's more than just that. I mean, what people fail to account is the enormous risk that comes with playing sports at that level. I mean, the likelihood of injury is very high. I mean, not necessarily career-ending injury, but just injury. And any injury does impact your ability to go to the pros because it makes you weaker. It makes you perform worse. Your evaluations are worse. So, and on top of that, many of these players have very short average time. Of the few who get to go, have very short careers in the pros. I think the average NFL career is something like 3 years, which isn't even out of your rookie contract.
Yeah, I think that we're kind of lined up here on the trials and tribulations of being a college athlete. I think another important element of this bill comes from the element of what the NCAA's role is here and how they would tend to respond to an athlete who did try to do this right now. What the bill does is it creates protections from that player facing discipline or being removed from a game for having an agent or for signing an endorsement deal, right? Because the NCAA doesn't actually control the players directly. None of the players have a contract with the NCAA, but all of the schools contract with the NCAA. And so the schools are pressured through those agreements to abide by these sort of income regulating rules, or else, well, the greatest leverage that the NCAA holds is they hold all the broadcasting contracts. So if you want your game with USC to be broadcast and get, millions of dollars in revenue for your program, you're going to have to play by the NCAA's rules and enforce that on your players.
Well, and do you think this is the same for, every team? I mean, not every team is as popular as another team. Do you think that, if let's say just, the University of Alabama alone were to try to do this, do you think that the NCAA would still, try to prevent broadcasting those games? I mean, some of these teams are incredibly popular. I mean, in California, UCLA is an incredibly popular team that lots of people watch. I mean, the amount of revenue loss must be enormous if they were to try and...
This has happened before. The NCAA actually had, I believe it was Notre Dame, tried to stand up to it. Tried to say, you can't afford to sanction us because people love us, and Notre Dame is a huge program. The NCAA stuck by their guns, and eventually it was Notre Dame that folded. One advantage that this bill has is that it's a statewide in California, and so we're not talking about just UCLA being hugely popular. We also have USC, we have Stanford, we have all of those teams, and California itself is just a massive media market.
I mean, just in a population-wise, there's a large portion of the country there, and the NCAA made roughly like $1 billion last year. I'm sure more than a small amount of that came from that market.
Oh no, absolutely. And so while the NCAA has proven their unabiding, relentless determination to enforce their policies on players in the past, they've only done it against single schools with major programs, and they have been able to get them to back down. I really think that they are worried now that it's the entire state of California.
And you kind of discussed protections for the players. What do those look like?
Protections from the players. So that's an interesting thing because the NCAA seems to be the most worried body about this bill, but the protections themselves, at least the main protection afforded by it, is that they can't be removed from play because they've signed an endorsement bill, which only the school itself would have the power to remove a student from play. So it seems like it's just removing the school's ability to act on the NCAA's behalf. They can't actually be prevented from playing because they've been endorsed.
Well, I mean, that for me, that seems kind of semantics. What would stop, I don't know, a popular running back at UCLA, maybe not someone who's the, not someone who they couldn't find a replacement for or a backup nearly as good, but, somebody who was replaceable, and why wouldn't they just not start that person? You'd be able to, not quote unquote remove them from play for like suspending them, but, something that's less tangible, something that's a little more subtle.
Right, okay. That is a good question. I don't see the bill actually preventing against that, but one benefit I would say is that this doesn't seem to be a business regulation, which does give the players the benefit, especially since a lot of these schools are state actors, or at least treated like state actors for accepting state money. I don't see them getting the benefit of the business judgment rule, which is a rule in a lot of corporate law that says that if a business is making a business decision and you haven't proved that they were acting like to commit a fraud or otherwise acting in bad faith, you give them very wide latitude to make decisions on how to run their business, which could be applied here to say, the coaches have very wide latitude in saying what players to play. I don't see that actually being applied here because they're state actors, and so they're not going to have as strong of a presumption coming in. You're right, though. If a player is pulled because of an endorsement deal, it looks like the burden of proof will be on that individual if they sue under this law. So yeah, it's very much an interesting situation. One thing that I'll say again is that this isn't slated to go into effect until 2023, which is a long window. I think it's so that no player who's in school right now will still be playing by the time it's effective. But I do think it's going to be interesting to see in the next four years or so how the NCAA is able to grapple with the state of California and where this might end up leading before it actually goes into effect, because it can be amended before it's effective. Also, to see if any other states jump on the bandwagon. There's been talk about this happening in other states like South Carolina. New York is talking about passing a similar law that would not only allow endorsement deals, but would divert some revenue from ticket sales to players.
Well, and how would this affect existing broadcasting contracts, right? Because I'm assuming there was something in the contracts between these colleges and the NCAA in their broadcasting rights were exchanged, that the NCAA probably put a provision in there that forced schools, to remove players before this. So if that was an existing covenant in the contract, how would that be affected by a law basically preventing that covenant from existing?
Right, so you actually can't have a binding contract for illegal services. And so if it's illegal for the school to enforce the NCAA's player policies as they're written, which it will be when this law goes into effect, then they can choose not to remove players for having endorsement deals without violating their contract to enforce the NCAA's regulations, because that part of the contract, that part of the contract would no longer be considered binding.
But the rest of the contract would still be enforceable.
Yeah, typically these contracts will have clauses in them. I am blanking on the name right now.
Severable?
But severability clauses, which will say if any part of this contract is deemed unenforceable, that will not affect any other parts of the contract from being enforced, which means that they intend to abide by all the terms that remain legally enforceable.
Well, I think that's it for today's show. If you guys have any questions, please give us an email at juristjargon@gmail.com. Thank you very much. Have a great week, you guys.
Talk to you guys next week.